There's an old legend about a witch who lived in the forest, cloaked in darkness and a scent so foul it could rot the air. But this witch wasn't born in the wild. She was Lyla, the first daughter of a noble house, and her curse started the moment she took her first breath. Her parents didn't see a miracle, they saw a monster. They couldn't stand to be in the same room as her. So they threw her away, leaving her to grow up like an animal in the back of the stables. From the shadows of her wooden cage, Lyla watched a world she wasn't allowed to join. She saw her father doting on her younger sister Ariadne, giving her the love Lyla was denied. Ariadne lived like a princess, laughing in the sunlight while Lyla rotted in the dark. Every now and then, Lyla would risk a peek, just wanting to feel like she belonged. But Ariadne always knew where she was hiding. And she didn't just ignore her sister, she enjoyed making her feel like dirt. Ariadne would smirk, knowing exactly how much power she had over the witch in the shadows. Lyla's heart sank when she heard Ariadne calling out to their father, ready to play her games. The younger sister was always surrounded by beauty, the perfect contrast to Lyla's supposed filth. Lord Valencia didn't even look back as he walked away, leaving his eldest daughter behind without a second thought. Lyla could only bite her lip and swallow her tears, used to being the family's dirty secret. Years passed, and the neglect only got worse until she was eventually banished to a cabin deep in the woods. Even then, Ariadne couldn't leave her alone, showing up just to remind Lyla how much everyone hated her. She'd stand there with a bright smile, acting like the perfect lady while treating her sister like garbage. Lyla eventually stopped fighting it, accepting her role as the cursed witch of the forest. She lived in absolute solitude, hidden away from a world that feared her very presence. The villagers told stories of a beast that would come for them, a nightmare born from the witch's curse. Whenever Lyla was spotted near the village, Ariadne was there to incite the mob, making sure her sister stayed an outcast. The locals would laugh and jeer, treating Lyla's suffering like a town holiday. She'd run back into the safety of the dark trees, the only place that didn't scream at her. Ariadne watched her flee, satisfied that her perfect life was safe from her sister's stench. The rumors spread like wildfire, with parents using the witch's name to scare their kids into behaving. But one day, two strangers arrived in town, their presence commanding attention from everyone they passed. Suri adjusted his hood, looking a bit overwhelmed by the local gossip. Viorst didn't care about the rumors. He had his own reasons for being in these backwoods. Suri hurried to keep up, wondering why the crown prince was so interested in a local legend. They discussed the witch, with Suri noting that if she really had that much influence over the village, she might be dangerous. They eventually made their way to the Valencia Manor, the home of the family that cast Lyla out. Inside, the tea was flowing, and the atmosphere was light, a far cry from Lyla's cold cabin. The Valencia family was hosting their royal guest, eager to show off their hospitality. Ariadne was in her element, putting on her best innocent maiden act for the visitors. Lord Valencia couldn't stop laughing, thinking he was finally securing his family's future. Ariadne kept a sweet look on her face, but she was already counting her chickens. She tried to get close to Viorst, blushing and playing the part of a smitten noblewoman. Her parents looked on with pride, convinced their daughter was about to become royalty. But then something changed, and the sweat started to bead on the Lord's lip. Both he and his wife were suddenly on edge, as if their carefully built web of lies was starting to fray. Ariadne's mask slipped into a snarl when she spotted a familiar, cloaked figure through the garden gates. Lord Valencia is in a total panic. He can't believe Lyla actually showed up at the estate while they have guests. Ariadne just laughs it off, looking all smug and pretty in her fancy pink dress. The parents are huddled in the back, terrified their dirty secret is about to get out. Out at the gate, Lyla is just standing there, looking like a mess. Even the guard is covering his nose like she's a walking dumpster. She looks completely defeated, her face covered in dirt and her hair a bird's nest. She stares through the bars, hoping for just a tiny bit of help from her own family. She tries to say something, but the words barely make it past her lips. The guard isn't having it. He blocks her with his spear just as Ariadne swaggers over, hiding her face behind a fan. Ariadne acts like she's some refined lady, but she's just there to rub salt in the wound. She stares down her sister from the other side of the gate, looking at her like she's a stray dog. It's a pretty stark contrast, one sister in silk, the other in rags. Lyla looks like she's about to break, the rejection hitting her hard. Ariadne doesn't have an ounce of pity. She just hides behind her fan and judges Lyla for even existing. With a sharp clap of her hands, she ends the conversation. She looks genuinely annoyed that she even had to step outside and deal with this. She rubs her temple like Lyla is some massive headache she can't get rid of. Then, she tosses a single gold coin on the ground, treating her sister like a common beggar. Lyla just stands there shaking, humiliated, and hurt. Ariadne lets out a mock laugh, enjoying every second of her sister's misery. That finally snaps something in Lyla. She glares back, absolutely fuming. Her eyes go cold, the pain turning into pure, unadulterated anger. Ariadne doesn't care. She just turns her back and walks away like she just finished chores. Lyla is forced to head back into the pouring rain, walking toward the dark forest all alone. She looks back one last time, her face a mask of grief and dirt. To make things worse, she's got a nasty gash on her leg that's bleeding through her dress. Back at her miserable little cabin, she just sits there in the dark. She clenches her fist against the rough table, the unfairness of it all eating her alive. A brass candlestick lies forgotten on the floor, a reminder of how little she has. The anger fades back into tears, the loneliness finally catching up to her. It's just her and the four walls of a shack, with no one coming to save her. But the rage comes back quick. She's sick of being the witch everyone hates. She grits her teeth, her patience finally hitting the breaking point. The villagers aren't any better. Some guy starts yelling at her, probably just looking for someone to blame for his own problems. She spends her days hauling heavy firewood through the forest, just trying to stay warm. By the time she gets back, she's completely spent, sitting in the shadows of her own home. She looks like she's aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Her lips are parched, and her face is caked in grime. Life in the forest is taking its toll. She's got a few bags of supplies by the door, probably what that coin Ariadne threw bought her. Suddenly, she hears something. Her eyes widen as she looks toward the entrance. She scrambles to her feet, heart racing. She stares intensely at the door, wondering who could possibly be out there in this weather. Someone is knocking, and in this middle-of-nowhere forest, that's never a good sign. Lyla stands frozen, her heart thumping against her ribs as she stares at the wooden door. Her eyes are wide with a mix of fear and confusion, wondering who would come all the way out here. With a slow, ominous creak, the heavy door finally swings open. Lyla gasps, looking up at the imposing figure that suddenly appeared out of the rain and darkness. Standing there is a strikingly handsome man with messy black hair and sharp golden eyes that seem to pierce right through her. He's dressed in an expensive-looking black cloak with a deep red lining and an ornate golden brooch, looking completely out of place in her rundown cabin. Lyla Violet de Valencia stands at the door of her cabin, staring out into the rain at a giant man in a black cloak. Her face is covered in soot, and she looks terrified of the unexpected visitor. The stranger, Viorst Black de Onlian, stands tall in the downpour with his face mostly hidden. In a flashback, the girl is completely abandoned, left behind while a man walks away without looking back. She's spent years living like a ghost in this forest, hidden away from a world that hates her. Back in the present, the man at her door gives her a very suspicious smile. Viorst greets her warmly, as if he didn't just stumble onto the home of a witch. Thunder rolls over the rickety shack, making the atmosphere even more tense. Lyla's shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watches him. He puts on a bit of a performance, acting like a helpless traveler who's lost his way. Then, he pulls out a gold coin to show he's willing to pay for his stay. The blonde girl's jaw drops. She probably hasn't seen that much money in years. Even so, she tries to shut him out, wanting nothing to do with any outsider. The storm just keeps getting worse, making it impossible for him to leave anyway. Viorst asks if she's really going to leave a traveler out in this weather. Lyla's hand closes around a heavy brass fire poker. She points the metal rod right at him and tells him to get lost. The man doesn't move an inch. He just stares back with a calm expression. He raises his gloved hands in a gesture of peace, though he's still got that smirk. The girl isn't buying it, her suspicion only growing. She keeps her weapon raised, refusing to lower her guard for even a second. To her surprise, Viorst just pulls up a chair and plops down at the table. He acts like he's perfectly welcome to stay, ignoring her threats entirely. Lyla's left speechless, her face flushed with pure frustration. She stays back and stares him down, still clutching the poker. Finally, she slams the metal object down onto the table with a loud clatter. Viorst's eyes narrow, and they've got a sharp, intense glint to them. He just laughs it off, trying to keep things light. The girl isn't amused and keeps her brow furrowed in a deep frown. He reaches into his cloak and pulls out a small drawstring bag. Viorst starts digging through his supplies, while Lyla demands to know what he thinks he's doing. She's shouting at the top of her lungs, but he completely ignores her. Suddenly, he holds up a plate of dried meat like it's a gourmet treasure. Lyla stares at the food, her hunger fighting against her fear. The stranger starts eating his share while she huddles on the floor in the corner. He watches her closely, his eyes fixed on her every movement. When he tries to speak to her, the poor girl flinches as if he's about to strike. She wonders why this man hasn't run away from her stench yet. He just gives her another warm, disarming grin. For a moment, she remembers what it was like to be a normal child. But those memories just make her current isolation hurt even more. Lyla eventually creeps closer to the pot, her stomach finally winning the argument. Viorst Black Dionlian closes his eyes, seemingly overwhelmed by the heavy atmosphere in the room. He keeps that smooth, polite tone while continuing his conversation with the girl. Lyla Violet de Valencia watches him closely, her blue eyes filled with suspicion and doubt. She suddenly whips around, her long blonde hair flying as she reacts to his words. The girl stares up at the nobleman, still trying to figure out what his game is. They sit in silence for a moment in the cramped, dimly lit cabin. Lyla is clearly at her limit, covered in the dirt of the forest, and looking exhausted. Viorst just keeps smiling, acting as if they're in a palace instead of a shack. In his mind, she isn't some cursed witch, she's a beauty surrounded by the sweet scent of roses. Lyla stands frozen, as if she's just realized someone might finally see her differently. Outside, the rain continues to lash against the small, dirty window. She turns back toward the hearth, her mind racing with a million questions. She studies the stranger's face, searching for any sign that he might be lying. The prince rubs his head, looking a bit weary from the long night's events. Lyla looks up at him, her expression a mix of absolute awe and disbelief. Her breath hitches, and she can't even find the right words to respond. A small, hopeful look flashes across her face, for the first time in a very long time. The village is in a frenzy, shouting about the cursed witch who brings ruin to their land. Ariadne watches the chaos she helped create, her cold blue eyes full of secret satisfaction. Viorst just smiles, completely unmoved by the superstitions of the common folk. In a derelict cabin deep in the woods, Lyla turns away, her face smudged with dirt and sorrow. Viorst catches a sudden scent in the air that makes his heart skip a beat. He clutches his head as a wild, beastly power surges within him, his eyes glowing amber. Lyla remains still, feeling the weight of the prince's intense, unblinking gaze. He pulls her into a sudden embrace, breathing in the scent that the rest of the world calls a curse. Back in the city, Viorst presents the face of a perfect nobleman, wine and roses in hand. His hand slams down on the table, the sound echoing through the small cabin. He stands up, his tall shadow looming over Lyla like a predator claiming its prize. Lyla shrinks back, her heart sinking as she waits for the rejection she's so used to. They sit in the dim light of her home, two people from completely different worlds. Viorst looks away, a genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He glances at his own hand, still feeling the warmth of the girl the world discarded. Lyla looks up in shock, unable to believe someone like him would stay. When he finally leaves, the silence of the forest feels heavier than ever before. Miles away, the Valencia manor is lit up for a lavish dinner party. Viorst is the guest of honor, sitting across from the family that cast Lyla out. He pushes his soup around with a spoon, his appetite non-existent. Lord Valencia breaks out in a sweat, sensing the prince's growing displeasure. Viorst offers a polite, chilling smile to his hosts. The Baron tries to cover his nerves with a loud, forced laugh. Ariadne and her father do their best to keep their royal guest entertained. Viorst's eyes turn sharp as he listens to their shallow, lying words. Lord Valencia keeps talking, his face flushing as he tries to fill the silence. The prince swishes the dark red wine in his glass, watching it swirl. His grip tightens until his knuckles turn white, his patience wearing thin. The Baron starts to tremble, feeling the pressure coming off the prince in waves. Ariadne dabs her lips with a napkin, acting like the perfect innocent lady. She speaks up suddenly, causing her father to jump in surprise. She puts a hand to her chest, putting on a show of distress for Viorst's benefit. Viorst watches her performance with a look of feigned concern, hiding his utter disgust. Lord Valencia can't stop fidgeting with his utensils, unable to look the prince in the eye. Ariadne leans in closer, her blue eyes shining with cold ambition. She glances toward the window, her mind already spinning with new schemes. The dinner continues, a hollow display of nobility and lies. Viorst closes his eyes, letting the Baron's rambling voices fade into the background. In his mind, Lyla is a delicate flower blooming in a field of blood-red roses. He thinks back to the start of the night when he first approached her forest home. His boot splashes into a puddle as he treks through the pouring rain. He catches her scent on the wind again, his breath hitching as he reaches for the door. Viorst gasps for air in the forest, the scent driving him to the brink of madness. Even at the formal dinner, the memory of that fragrance haunts him. His golden eyes flash with a hunger he can barely suppress. In a flashback, Lyla screams in frustration, her face covered in the grime of the forest. She clutches a single candle, begging for just enough light to survive the night. Instead of help, her family treats her like an animal, throwing coins at her like scraps for a beggar. A coin clatters against the wood of her lonely forest shack. In the present, Viorst takes a slow sip of wine, his mind far from the dining room. His golden eyes narrow as he listens to the Valencia family's shallow lies. Ariadne blushes, convinced she's already charmed the Empire's most eligible bachelor. Viorst smiles back, but the expression is as cold as the wine in his glass. She glows with excitement, unaware that she's being toyed with. Lord Valencia lets out a hearty laugh, celebrating a connection he thinks will save his house. Outside, the manor stands silent under the silver moonlight. Viorst follows Ariadne through the dark corridors, her lantern casting long shadows. She suddenly loses her footing, her pink heel slipping on the stone floor. Viorst catches her before she falls, his hands firm on her shoulders. Ariadne looks up at him, her face flushed with surprise and adoration. She leans into his touch, relishing the feel of his strong arms. He pulls her upright, but his face remains a stony mask of indifference. He sees the stark contrast between the pampered Ariadne and the sister she left to rot. Ariadne notices the sudden chill in the air, her smile faltering for a brief second. She quickly tries to charm him again, looking up with a sweet, pleading expression. He lifts her back onto her feet with effortless, mechanical grace. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifts, and Ariadne looks truly rattled. Her blue eyes widen in fear as she catches a glimpse of his true nature. Viorst stares back, his golden eyes cold and devoid of the gentleman persona he's been wearing. Viorst is clearly in a bad mood, scowling as he turns away from the conversation. He stomps through the hallway, his expression stone cold and eyes focused straight ahead. Meanwhile, far from the palace, a lonely wooden cabin sits tucked away in the middle of a dense forest. Viorst marches into the room, calling out for his attendant to attend to him immediately. Suri is busy tending to the fireplace when he hears the prince's heavy footsteps approaching. The prince looks absolutely fed up, and his companion can tell right away that dinner didn't go well. He starts pulling at his cravat, wanting nothing more than to be out of these restrictive formal clothes. Viorst carelessly tosses his coat toward the side, and Suri catches it with practiced ease. He unbuttons his shirt, letting out a long, frustrated sigh while the red-haired attendant watches in silence. Suri exits the room quietly, leaving his master alone with his brooding thoughts. Finally alone, Viorst sits in the dim light of his room, staring off into space as if searching for something. Back at that forest cabin, the wind picks up as a heavy storm begins to roll in. Inside the drafty room, Lyla sits alone in the dark, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. She pulls off her tattered, filthy dress, revealing skin covered in dirt and soot from her daily chores. Shivering, she steps out into the cool night air, headed toward the nearby water. Lyla makes her way toward the edge of the lake, her face pale and looking completely drained. She slowly wades into the water, hoping to wash away at least some of the day's misery. Looking down at the surface, she thinks about the scraps of food and spent candles she had to beg for earlier. She remembers her sister Ariadne laughing in her face, treating her like she was some kind of monster. Lyla bites her lip, the memory of those cruel insults still stinging just as much as they did the first time. Tears finally spill over as she clutches her chest, completely overwhelmed by the crushing loneliness. Suddenly, a figure wrapped in a heavy black cloak appears right at her cabin door. Lyla freezes in the middle of the lake, hearing a strange noise coming from the shore. The leaves rustle violently in the wind as she looks around in a total panic. She's terrified that someone has actually found her secret hiding spot deep in the woods. The forest seems to close in on her as the clouds darken and the wind howls. Lyla quickly throws on her own dark cloak, trying her best to hide her face from any prying eyes. She starts the long walk toward the village, keeping to the shadows to avoid being noticed. As she enters the town, she keeps her hood low, but a man nearby immediately stops eating. People around her start coughing and covering their noses as soon as she passes by them. Whispers break out in the crowd about a sudden, horrible smell that's hitting the marketplace. Lyla heads straight for a butcher shop, hoping to make her purchase and leave before things get worse. She glances around nervously, feeling the weight of everyone's judging eyes on her back. She approaches the counter, trying to keep as much distance as possible from the butcher. Under her hood, she's practically trembling, just wanting to get some food and go home. The butcher starts off friendly enough, smiling as he prepares to serve his next customer. But then he catches a whiff of the air and his expression shifts to one of pure disgust. Lyla sees the sudden change in his face and realizes her cover has been blown. He starts sniffing around the counter, wondering where that rotten stench is coming from. Afraid of a scene, Lyla turns and stumbles away from the shop as fast as her legs can carry her. The butcher complains loudly to the next lady in line, claiming he's never smelled anything so foul in his life. Lyla looks back with tears in her eyes, heartbroken to be treated like a plague once again. People nearby began sniffing the air, their faces twisting as they caught a whiff of something foul. Lyla tried to hurry away, but the butcher and his customers had already turned toward her in disgust. The butcher scratched his head, looking around in confusion for the source of the sudden, sickening stench. His eyes widened as he realized the smell was coming from the hooded girl standing right in front of him. He began shouting, telling her to get lost before she ruined his business with her presence. Lyla rushed through the marketplace, the crowd parting around her as if she were a walking plague. Suddenly, a large hand reached out and grabbed her shoulder, stopping her dead in her tracks. She lost her footing and slipped, falling hard onto the dusty ground in front of everyone. Her hand hit the dirt with a heavy thud, scraping against the rough stones of the street. The butcher stood over her with his arms crossed, looking down with a mixture of anger and fear. Lyla flinched, curling her body away as the man continued to tower over her on the ground. He pointed a finger at her and began yelling, making sure every passerby knew she wasn't welcome. The man scrambled backward in a panic, begging her to spare him as if she were a monster. Nearby, a young child burst into tears, terrified by the commotion and the sight of the witch. Lyla slowly stood up, her shadow stretching across the ground as the butcher trembled before her. Beads of sweat rolled down the man's face as he looked up at her with pure terror in his eyes. In a desperate move to get her to leave, he hurriedly grabbed a package and held it out. He shoved the food toward her, his hands shaking as he tried to end the encounter as fast as possible. Lyla stared at the man, her expression hidden under her hood as she reached for the package. She dropped a coin into his hand with a quiet clink, refusing to just take what she hadn't paid for. Clutching the food to her chest, she stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of their hatred. The butcher winced and closed his eyes, clearly terrified of even being within reach of her. Lyla turned and walked away, her legs covered in dirt and the scars of a lifetime of abuse. Behind her, the man slumped to the ground, panting heavily as if he had just escaped a beast. She left the town behind, heading back toward the silence of the forest, while the butcher watched from his knees. As she reached the trees, a man in a blue cloak suddenly stepped into her path, causing her to flinch. Lyla looked up with wide, tear-filled eyes, terrified that another stranger had come to hunt her down. The stranger, Viorst, stared back at her with a look of calm intrigue instead of the usual revulsion. He leaned in close, his golden eyes searching hers as if he were seeing something beautiful. Overwhelmed by the sudden attention, Lyla turned and bolted toward her cabin as fast as she could. She reached her small wooden shack and hurried inside, desperate for the safety of her four walls. Leaning against the table, she struggled to catch her breath, her chest heaving from the sprint and the stress. She looked down, the grime on her face a constant reminder of why the world treated her like trash. The door opened, and Viorst stepped inside with a sack over his shoulder, his presence filling the small room. Lyla stood her ground, her face twisting in a mix of anger and fear at the man who wouldn't leave her alone. Instead of commenting on her smell, a soft, amused smile spread across the stranger's face. Viorst leaned in toward her, his gaze intense as he ignored the stench that usually drove men away. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in years, Lyla didn't feel a blow coming. She sank to the floor, the darkness of her isolation finally starting to break under his touch. Viorst looked down at her with a calm expression, seemingly unbothered by the state of her home. Lyla stared back, her mouth agape as she struggled to understand this man's strange behavior. She flinched as he took another step, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and growing curiosity. Viorst reached into a sack and pulled out a handful of thick white candles, his movements casual and effortless. With a sharp spark, he lit a match and held it to the wick of a candle, the small flame casting a warm light across the room. He held the glowing candle toward Lyla, the flickering light illuminating her shocked and weary face. Lyla glanced up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief that anyone would bring her such a luxury. Viorst smiled warmly, his usual cold demeanor completely gone as he looked at the girl before him. His expression shifted to one of quiet satisfaction as he thought of his previous night's work. Viorst stood outside in the pouring rain, pulling his cloak tightly around him to ward off the chill. Inside the safety of the cabin, he sat at the small table and happily began eating the soup Lyla had prepared. Lyla stood a few paces away, watching him in silence, her mind spinning as she tried to understand why he was there. She looked down at herself, feeling the weight of her own misery and the dirt that seemed to cling to her soul. With a rhythmic tap of his fingers, Viorst gestured to the bag of candles and a bowl of fresh strawberries he had brought. He looked up at her from the table, his presence filling the cramped room with an intensity she couldn't ignore. Lyla stared at the gifts, her mouth slightly agape as she struggled to find the right words to say. Viorst beamed at her, his smile bright enough to rival the candle flame as he waited for her reaction. Feeling overwhelmed, Lyla turned away sharply, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. She could feel his eyes on her, and beads of sweat began to form on her forehead as the tension grew. Viorst spoke softly, his voice low and soothing, as he tried to bridge the gap between them. As she moved, the light from the candle caught a fresh, bloody scrape on the back of Lyla's hand. Before she could pull away, Viorst reached out and firmly grabbed her injured hand. He pulled her closer, ignoring her flinch of surprise as he inspected the small wound with predatory focus. To her absolute horror, he brought her hand to his lips and slowly licked away the crimson blood. Lyla flinched, her whole body trembling as the man continued to hold her hand with a dark smile. He tilted his head, his golden eyes glowing with a strange hunger as he tasted her blood again. The room felt colder as he pressed his mouth against her skin, his touch both terrifying and intimate. Lyla's face flushed a deep red, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at him in pure shock. Viorst pulled back just enough to reveal a sharp, fang-like tooth, a drop of blood still clinging to his lip. With a sudden yank, he pulled her fully into his personal space, leaving no room for her to retreat. He gripped her arms, steadying her as she struggled to process what had just happened. His eyes were fixed on hers, the golden irises shimmering with an intensity that made her feel like prey. Viorst leaned in close, his presence overwhelming her as he refused to let her go. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the rain lashing against the trees and the thin walls of the cabin. Later, Lyla huddled in a corner, pulling her tattered cloak around her as she wept in silence. Viorst stood nearby, looking down at her with a gentle, almost sorrowful expression that confused her even more. He reached out and took her hands again, his touch firm yet surprisingly careful. Viorst leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as if he were trying to share her burden. Lyla pulled back with a sharp swish of her cloak, unable to accept such a display of tenderness. Viorst looked at her, his eyes reflecting a momentary hurt that he quickly tried to mask. Her lower lip trembled as she looked at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his attention. She stood there, a mess of golden hair and dirty clothes, looking at the prince with a defiant sadness. Viorst's gaze didn't waver, his golden eyes filled with a determination that both scared and intrigued her. Lyla stood in the shadows, watching as the man who should have despised her acted like her protector. A confident smile returned to Viorst's face, as if he had already decided that Lyla belonged to him. After the prince's departure, Lyla sat in the heavy silence of her cabin, the shadows stretching across the floor like dark fingers. Outside, the sound of a horse's snort broke the quiet, a lingering sign that her world had been irrevocably changed. Through the rough-hewn window, the moonlight caught the glint of her blonde hair as she stared blankly into the night. Earlier, Viorst had adjusted his cloak with a suave slip of the fabric, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. The air in the small cabin had been thick with tension as they sat together, two worlds colliding in the most unexpected way. Lyla had felt a sudden rush of heat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she tried to process the prince's touch. Across the table, Viorst remained perfectly composed, his gaze intense as he watched her every move. A sudden, sharp pain flared in Lyla's chest, causing her to gasp and press her hand against her heart in distress. Viorst's expression hadn't changed, his golden eyes remaining fixed on her with a cold, analytical curiosity. He stood over her, his tall frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow her whole in the dim light. Meanwhile, far from the forest, Lord Valencia stood in his courtyard, his brow furrowed with irritation as he spoke to his staff. Beyond the manor gates, an angry mob had gathered, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and hatred. Lord Valencia flinched as a particularly loud shout reached his ears, his face pale with the realization that he was losing control. In the collective mind of the townspeople, Lyla was nothing more than a ghost, a shadowed figure that brought ruin wherever she went. One man in the crowd, his face twisted with grief, shouted about the curse that had ruined his life and livelihood. The villagers stood united in their anger, their faces illuminated by the torches they held against the encroaching dark. Lord Valencia let out a weary huff of breath, the stress of his daughter's existence finally taking its toll on his health. He gestured dismissively toward the crowd, ordering his guards to clear the rabble before they could do any real damage. Lyla's mind drifted back to a time when she was still a lady of the house, dressed in silk and lace, but feeling like an outcast. She remembered the way people would recoil when she passed, their faces twisting in the same disgust that fueled the mob today. Standing in the lush gardens, she had realized that no amount of beauty could mask the stench they claimed followed her. Back in the courtyard, Lord Valencia turned to his butler, his eyes hard and cold as he contemplated his next move. Lord Valencia looked at his young daughter, who stood before him with a hopeful smile that he knew would eventually be crushed. Ariadne Valencia is absolutely livid, her face twisted in a mask of pure rage. She screams at the top of her lungs, letting out all her frustration. She stands with her arms crossed, looking down at Lord Valencia with utter contempt. Her father, Lord Valencia, breaks into a cold sweat as he tries to endure her temper. Ariadne scoffs and turns away, her long blonde hair whipping behind her. Lord Valencia watches her, his gaze heavy with a mix of fear and resignation. Ariadne forces a sweet, artificial smile, though it doesn't quite reach her cold eyes. The sight of her smile sends literal chills down Lord Valencia's spine. He's so shaken that his entire body starts to tremble, his hands clenching into tight, shaking fists. He looks at his daughter and sees a reflection of the darkness that's always been there. Lord Valencia's face drains of all color as he's hit with a disturbing memory. He recalls a young Ariadne standing over a dead, bloody bird with a chillingly vacant grin. Back in the present, he shuts his eyes tight, trying to block out the horrifying images. Outside the grand manor, a servant bows low as the family waits for an important visitor. Lord Valencia gulps, his nerves clearly frayed as he tries to keep his composure. Suri, a young man with messy red hair, sits in their drawing room, sipping tea with an air of casual indifference. He sits across from the Valencias, the silence in the room feeling heavy and awkward. Lord Valencia looks on with hope, his mind already spinning with visions of his future social standing. Ariadne sits demurely beside her father, playing the part of the perfect, modest noblewoman. Suri hesitates, resting his chin on his hand as if he's bored by the entire conversation. Ariadne offers a rehearsed, gentle smile, trying her best to appear charming. She carefully places a pouch on the table, her movements deliberate and controlled. A sharp, knowing smirk spreads across Suri's face as he watches her. He suddenly bursts into a laugh, leaning back as if he's just heard a particularly funny joke. Lord Valencia continues to sweat, clearly feeling out of his depth with their guest. Suri gives them one last smile, though it's masked by a cold layer of politeness. Deep in the dark forest, a humble wooden cabin stands alone under a clear, starlit night. Inside, a man with jet-black hair named Viorst sits at a rough table, smiling warmly. Lyla Violet de Valencia sits across from him, looking disheveled and covered in dirt. She bites her finger anxiously, her eyes wide with fear as she stares at this unexpected stranger. She bites down hard enough to draw a small drop of blood from her thumb. Viorst stands up and leans over her, his looming presence making the small cabin feel even tighter. Lyla looks up at him, her expression a mix of startle and confusion. She blushes deeply, her face turning a bright shade of red at his sudden proximity. Viorst reaches out and firmly grabs her hand before she can react. Without a word, he brings her bleeding finger to his mouth and licks the blood away. Lyla flinches, her eyes going wide as her heart hammers in her chest. Viorst maintains a firm grip on her hand, his touch steady and unyielding. A bead of sweat rolls down Lyla's face as she stares at him in complete shock. Viorst stares at her with an unsettling intensity, his gaze never wavering. Lyla's breath hitches, her mind racing to understand what's happening. He continues to examine her hand, his focus entirely on the girl he just met. Viorst's hand moves closer, making Lyla even more tense in the cramped space. He leans in, his sudden proximity catching her completely off guard and leaving her breathless. Lyla's face burns with a deep, uncontrollable blush as she struggles to process the intimacy. She stands frozen, her dirty and torn dress a stark reminder of the harsh life she leads in exile. High above, the dense forest canopy frames a dark, starry sky as night fully takes hold. Viorst offers a gentle, almost kind smile, but Lyla still watches him with deep suspicion. He stops suddenly in his tracks, and she looks up at him, wondering what could be on his mind. They find themselves standing in the middle of a beautiful, moonlit field filled with white daisies. Lyla's eyes widen as she takes in the unexpected sight, her face still flushed from their earlier encounter. Viorst watches her with a soft, intense expression, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They continue their quiet walk through the woods, the sound of their footsteps on the earth the only noise. Lyla keeps her head down and her hands clasped tightly, silently following the mysterious stranger. She's so flustered that her thoughts are a jumbled mess of confusion and lingering embarrassment. Viorst lets out a soft laugh at her reaction, clearly finding her genuine shock to be quite amusing. His golden, feline eyes remain fixed intently on her, as if he's studying every detail of her face. He tastes the blood from her finger once more, a dark and possessive look beginning to take over his features. Lyla hunches her shoulders, her embarrassment reaching a new peak as she tries to hide from his gaze. She can't fathom why a nobleman of his status would do something so incredibly strange and personal. Her heart continues to race, and she finds herself stealing another look at his striking, noble face. The tension between them is palpable, a silent connection forming in the heart of the dark forest. Meanwhile, back at the imperial palace, rumors are already circulating about the prince's mysterious new interests. In a grand, dimly lit throne room, a powerful figure sits in deep silence, contemplating the empire's future. Viorst sits alone in his lavish chambers, his expression cold and calculating as he makes his secret plans. He finds he can't get the image of Lyla's bright blue eyes out of his mind, the girl haunting his every thought. He stands alone in the shadows, his raw physical strength and beastly nature barely contained beneath his skin. Viorst vividly remembers the way she looked in his arms, fragile and beautiful like a rare, delicate flower. With a sudden, forceful movement, he crushes a bunch of yellow flowers in his hand, his obsession only growing. Nearby, a small white rabbit sniffs the air, instinctively sensing a powerful predator in the vicinity. It quickly hops away into the safety of the dense, green bushes to escape the perceived danger. Lyla is out in the woods again, her expression one of pure terror as she feels she's being watched. She reaches out for a low branch, her movements frantic and uncoordinated as she tries to flee. Startled by a sudden, sharp noise, she loses her balance and falls hard onto the muddy forest floor. She tries to pull herself back up, her hand reaching out for anything to steady her shaking body. She's horrified to realize that a series of deadly, jagged traps have been set up all around her path. Lyla bites her lip, her eyes darting around frantically as she tries to find a safe way through the danger. Her entire body shakes with fear, the full weight of her precarious situation finally hitting her. She desperately tosses a thick branch toward one of the traps, hoping to trigger it from a distance. Without looking back, she turns and bolts into the thicket, her heart pounding against her ribs. She's completely out of breath, her face covered in sweat and dirt from her desperate flight. Back in the cabin, Viorst looks at the drop of blood on his finger with a chilling, satisfied smirk. Lyla stops for a brief moment, her gaze filled with worry as she thinks about the man she left behind. She continues on her way, her silhouette slowly disappearing into the deep, dark shadows of the forest. A cold warning hangs in the air, a reminder for Lyla to stay in her place and not harbor any false hopes. Lord Valencia and Ariadne stand before their aide, suitcases packed as if preparing for a sudden departure from the manor. Suri observes the nervous father and daughter, his expression unreadable as they wait for him to speak. Ariadne cuts a sharp glance at her father, her patience clearly wearing thin with his constant, anxious hesitation. Suri sighs softly and looks away, appearing tired of dealing with the family's endless cycle of drama and deceit. Lord Valencia's eye twitches with fear, his gaze darting around as the immense pressure of the situation builds. A small, mocking smile plays on Suri's lips, further unsettling the already deeply anxious and guilty Lord. The Lord looks utterly distraught, sweat beads forming on his brow as he struggles to maintain any shred of composure. Ariadne finally snaps, her voice rising in a sharp spike of anger as she confronts the man standing before them. Her face is a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, her eyes wide with a manic intensity that cows her father into silence. Suri looks on with a mix of shock and quiet annoyance, entirely unimpressed by her sudden, childish outburst of temper. She clenches the fabric of her expensive gown so tightly that her knuckles turn white, her rage barely kept under control. Both Ariadne and Lord Valencia are left stunned, a deep sense of dread settling over them as they face the consequences of their actions. They take a heavy step back toward the grand entrance of the manor, the weight of their choices hanging over them like a shroud. Suddenly, a glass object shatters against the wall with a violent crash, sending sharp shards flying in every direction. Ariadne continues her tirade, her breathing heavy and ragged as she vents all her frustration and spite onto her father. She screams at him with everything she has, her beauty marred by the pure ugliness of her hateful expression. Lord Valencia looks down at his feet, his shoulders slumped in total defeat under his daughter's relentless verbal assault. A deep, permanent scowl remains etched on Ariadne's face, her mind already racing to find someone else to blame for her misery. She towers over her father, the power dynamic in their relationship clear as she dictates their next desperate move. Her mind flashes back to the day Lyla was paraded before the town, tied up like a common criminal on a wooden platform. Lord Valencia is haunted by the dark memory, his mouth agape as he recalls the terrible cruelty they inflicted on his other daughter. They stand in the opulent silence of the grand hall, the luxury of their surroundings, a stark contrast to Lyla's suffering. Ariadne looks out the window toward the distant forest, her eyes cold and calculating as she thinks of the sister she betrayed. Far away in the dark woods, small flickers of light begin to glimmer through the dense and tangled foliage. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps crunches through the undergrowth as someone moves purposefully through the night. Men carry flickering torches, the bright orange flames crackling and casting long, dancing shadows onto the ancient trees. They approach the small log cabin, the faint light from the window glimmering like a lonely beacon in the thick darkness. Lyla watches from the shadows, her face marked by dirt and scratches from the arduous life she's forced to live in exile. She stands by the window, her blonde hair messy and unkempt as she stares out into the cold and unforgiving night. Her blue dress is tattered and heavily stained with earth, a testament to the harsh conditions she endures every day. She gently touches the cuts on her neck and chin, the physical pain a dull echo of the profound loneliness in her heart. The memory of the angry, shouting crowd flashes through her mind, villagers who called for her head while she stood helpless. Shaking off the weight of the painful past, Lyla turns back toward the center of her small, humble home. She reaches for the heavy wooden door with a trembling, dirt-stained hand, her strength nearly spent. With a final, weary effort, she pulls the door shut, sealing herself away from the cold and judgmental world outside. Outside the cabin, several men with torches linger in the clearing, their dark intentions remaining unclear. Safe for now, Lyla leans her back against the door, her tattered dress and exhausted frame a true portrait of survival. Lord Valencia stands outside the forest cabin, looking at his daughter with nothing but contempt. He's screaming at her, making it clear she's no longer welcome in his world. He clenches his fist, done with the talking and ready to end this. He orders the rowdy mob to be quiet while he handles his family business. Lyla stands alone, facing a crowd of angry villagers armed with torches. The mob is riled up, shouting for the witch to pay for her curse. They close the circle, trapping her in the middle of the clearing. Someone thrusts a torch toward her face, the fire reflecting in her eyes. Two men lunge forward and grab her by the arms. She tries to pull away, but their grip is like iron. Tears start to sting her eyes as she realizes nobody is coming to help. They hold her in place, making sure she can't run as they prepare for the execution. The crowd continues to murmur, excited for the spectacle about to unfold. Lord Valencia watches the scene with a cold, indifferent stare. He glares at her with zero regret, like she's just a stain he needs to scrub away. Down on the forest floor, a shadow begins to stir. A massive, black-furred paw with razor-sharp claws digs into the dirt. Out of the darkness, a giant panther emerges, its eyes locked onto the crowd. It moves like a blur, pinning one of the attackers to the ground instantly. The villagers lose their minds, screaming as the predator enters the fray. The beast takes a heavy step forward, the ground practically shaking under its weight. It looms over Lord Valencia, making the nobleman look pathetic. For the first time tonight, the father looks genuinely terrified. Lyla keeps fighting, but the men holding her are paralyzed with fear. In a desperate move to regain control, her father turns his fury back on her. He yanks her towards him, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He reaches out and squeezes his hand around her neck. Lyla gasps, clawing at his hand as she struggles to breathe. She looks into her father's eyes and sees absolutely no soul behind them. Meanwhile, Viorst is watching everything from the shadows with a cold smile. He looks completely unfazed by the carnage, almost like he's watching a play. The panther lets out a deafening roar and lunges straight for the Baron. Lyla's vision starts to blur as the air is cut off from her lungs. The beast slams into her father, sending him crashing to the dirt. It stands tall over Lyla, growling a warning at anyone still nearby. Lyla stares up at the creature, unable to process what just saved her. The panther turns its attention to the rest of the villagers. It charges, scattering the mob like a pack of scared rabbits. Lyla watches the chaos, her heart still racing from the near-death experience. Watching from afar, Ariadne smiles as if everything is going exactly to plan. The men who were holding Lyla are now trembling, too scared to even look at her. They realize they've picked the wrong fight and start to scramble away into the woods. Lord Valencia grits his teeth in pure frustration, his face contorted with rage as things spiral out of control. The villagers who were holding Lyla flinch as the chaos erupts around them. One of the men clutches a knife, his hand shaking as he realizes they're in deep trouble. Lord Valencia raises a dagger high, ready to strike Lyla down himself before the beast gets to them. The surrounding villagers cower and tremble, completely overwhelmed by the violence. The Black Panther lets out a low growl, blood dripping from its fangs after the first strike. A shadow looms over the clearing as the beast continues its rampage against the mob. Lyla jolts back, her eyes wide with shock as the scene unfolds. The panther lunges again, sending the last of the villagers running for their lives. Lyla watches in horror as a lit torch is tossed toward the cabin. It hits the wooden steps, the dry timber catching fire in an instant. Within seconds, the entire cabin is engulfed in a massive, roaring inferno. Lyla stares at the flames, her heart sinking as everything she owns turns to ash. She stands alone in the middle of the destruction, looking completely broken. On the ground, a bloodied hand lies near a discarded blade, a grim reminder of the fight. The surviving villagers scramble into the woods, desperate to escape the carnage. Lord Valencia looks on from the shadows, his face grim as he watches the fire consume the evidence. Lyla stands with her back to the ruins, staring out into the dark forest. She turns around and finds the giant panther sitting there, watching her intently. She catches her breath, her lips trembling as she stares back at the creature. The beast is covered in blood, but its gaze is surprisingly calm as it watches her. Lyla looks at the monster, her face reflecting a mix of fear and exhaustion. The panther's golden eyes seem to burn with an almost human intelligence. Behind them, the roof of the cabin finally collapses into the roaring fire. Lyla watches the last of her old life crumble into nothingness right before her eyes. She blinks, noticing a movement in the shadows that isn't the panther. She looks around frantically, trying to figure out who or what is still there. She looks down, her expression filled with a hollow, deep-seated despair. From above, the clearing looks like a graveyard of charred wood and smoke. As she sits by the ruins, a man in a long, traveling cloak steps out from behind a tree. He pulls back his hood, revealing the handsome, cold features of Viorst. He begins to approach her, his movements graceful and completely effortless. Lyla looks up at him, shocked to see a noble in the middle of this disaster. Viorst stops a few feet away, looking down at her with a complicated stare. He watches her with a mixture of pity and a dark, obsessive interest. A gust of wind carries white ash and sparks across the clearing like snow. Lyla snaps at him, her survival instincts kicking back in as she glares. She grits her teeth, refusing to let this stranger see her weakness. She suddenly turns her back on him, her resolve hardening in an instant. She gives him one last distrustful look before making a move. She takes off, dashing into the dense forest to get away from him. Viorst watches her disappear, his heavy footsteps showing his annoyance at her escape. Viorst stands still, his golden eyes tracking Lyla as she vanishes into the dense forest. Lyla doesn't look back. Her only thought is to put as much distance as possible between herself and the beast. A small, intrigued smile plays on Viorst's lips. He hasn't found a chase this interesting in a long time. Close up on Lyla's blue eyes, which are clouded with fear and the stinging smoke of her destroyed home. Viorst looks almost amused, as if he's playing a game that only he knows the rules to. Lyla continues her frantic escape, her light blue dress torn and stained with soot. She finally bursts through the tree line and comes to a halt before the imposing iron gates of her father's estate. She grips the cold metal bars, her hands raw and bloodied from her trek through the thorns. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of survival as she gasps for air. Trembling, Lyla looks toward the mansion, the symbol of everything she was once cast away from. She can barely draw enough breath to speak, her throat dry and raspy from the smoke. The ornate patterns of the gate loom over her like a cage, mocking her sudden return. A guard on the other side of the bars stares at the bedraggled girl with a mixture of confusion and disgust. Lyla stands her ground, her gaze hard and unyielding despite her physical exhaustion. Intimidated by the sheer intensity in her eyes, the guard instinctively takes a step back. He flinches as she reaches out, his spear held loosely in his trembling hands. The adrenaline that carried Lyla this far begins to fade, leaving her swaying on her feet. With dirt smudged across her pale face, she looks like a ghost that has come to haunt the living. She pushes herself forward, her movements becoming more of a stumble than a dash. She stops short when a familiar, stern figure appears in the courtyard beyond the gate. Lord Valencia, her father, stares at the sight of his discarded daughter with absolute horror. He stands frozen, his eyes wide behind his mustache as he takes in her ruined state. Seeing him, the last of Lyla's composure breaks, and tears begin to well in her eyes. She turns her head away, unable to bear the rejection she expects to see on his face. Clutching her chest, Lyla feels the weight of everything she's lost. Her home, her mother, her peace. Lord Valencia approaches the gate slowly, looking at her as if she were a monster or a curse. His expression is pained, but it's the pain of a man whose reputation is being threatened by her return. Lyla's lower lip quivers as she tries to find the words to explain the nightmare she just lived through. Tears fall freely now, leaving clean streaks through the grime on her cheeks as she sobs. Lord Valencia suddenly shouts, his voice booming across the quiet morning air in a mix of panic and anger. He rubs his temple, letting out a frustrated sigh as he realizes he can't simply turn her away in this condition. Reluctantly, he signals for the gate to be opened, and Lyla begins to walk toward the house she once called home. Her only thought, echoing in the silence of her mind, is a desperate plea for rest. Viorst, Black de Onlian, the crown prince, sits there looking completely bored with the conversation. Across from him, Lord Valencia is sweating buckets. It's a tense standoff in the drawing room, and the Baron looks like he's about to snap. Lord Valencia has heard the rumors about the Crown Prince's coldness, but seeing that gaze in person is giving him actual chills. He keeps rambling, desperate to say the right thing to keep the prince interested. That's when the younger daughter, Ariadne Valencia, walks in wearing a black dress and a fake smile. She gives him a look that's supposed to be charming, but just comes off as desperate. Ariadne plops down on the sofa, trying to act like she belongs in his world. She immediately starts trashing her own sister, Lyla, calling her a cursed freak with a foul stench. She even pulls out the waterworks, crying about how much the witch has cost their family's fortune. She leans in, basically offering herself up as a much kinder and better choice for him. Viorst just gives her this dark little smirk that doesn't reach his eyes. Ariadne flinches. The temperature in the room just dropped to sub-zero. She starts to panic as she realizes her kind-hearted mask isn't working. The prince stands over her, looking at her like she's a noisy pest rather than a person. The girl is practically hyperventilating from the pressure he's putting off. She tries to keep talking, gesturing wildly as her story starts to fall apart. But Viorst has heard enough of her lies. His eyes sharpen, something primal and dangerous is finally waking up. Both the Baron and Ariadne scramble back, sensing the shift in the air. It's like they're staring into the open mouth of a predator that's tired of waiting. Lord Valencia collapses to his knees, his composure completely shattered. Viorst doesn't say a word, he just turns his back on them and starts to walk away. Desperate as her prize began to slip through her fingers, Ariadne lost all calm and lunged forward, seizing Viorst's arm. Ariadne screams as she realizes she's pushed him too far. The blade slides out with a sharp metallic ring. Viorst, who detests being touched by those he deems filthy, did not hesitate for a single second. With a blinding flash of steel, he unsheathed his blade and severed Ariadne's hands the very moment she dared to lay a finger on him. Ariadne screams in agony as she watches her own hands fall to the floor. To him, Laying a finger on Lyla was nothing short of a death sentence. Viorst turned to Suri and gave a cold, lethal command. "Burn the Valencia manor to the ground. They dared to insult my future crown princess. Erase everything. Leave nothing but ashes." Viorst and his guard, Suri, walk out of the drawing room like nothing happened. The old man can only watch as his family's entire future walks out the door. A second later, the whole room is swallowed by a massive wall of fire. The entire Valencia manor burns to the ground, erasing their house from history. We shift to Lyla Violet de Valencia, looking like she's reached her breaking point. She's standing alone in a lake, the cold water swirling around her waist. She takes another step forward, letting the current pull at her dress. Closing her eyes, she decides she's finally had enough of the abuse. She lets herself tip back, and the water rushes in to claim her. She sinks deeper into the silence, thinking this is the only way to escape her personal hell. As the light fades away, she just drifts down into the darkness and lets go. Lyla Violet de Valencia's hair floats around her like seaweed as she sinks deeper into the cold water. A sudden, violent splash breaks the silence of the lake. A pair of strong hands reach through the bubbles and grab her before she can drift away. Viorst Black Dion Leon pulls her up from the dark depths, his own clothes soaking wet as he fights the current. They break the surface, gasping for air, as he drags her toward the muddy shore. Lyla is coughing and sputtering, her body shaking from the shock of being saved when she wanted to end it all. Viorst looks down at her with a mix of worry and frustration, asking why she would try to leave him behind like that. She grinds her teeth, the cold biting into her skin as she realizes she's still in this world. She starts to struggle in his grip, screaming at him to just let her go. Lyla shouts that she's a witch, repeating the same cruel lies her family used to exile her. But Viorst doesn't let go, standing firm in the shallow water as the ripples wash around them. She begs him to just leave her alone, tears mixing with the lake water on her pale face. He just calls her name, his voice steady enough to cut right through her panic. Viorst gently pulls her closer, his gaze softening as he looks at her bedraggled form. Then he gives her a warm, genuine smile, the kind of look no one has ever given her before. They stand there in the shallow water for a long moment, the initial tension finally starting to drain away. Lyla is still breathless, her mind racing to understand why this stranger is being so kind. A close-up of Viorst's eye reveals that golden, predatory glint that hints at the power he's hiding. He takes her cold hands in his and tells her that a place like this forest doesn't suit someone like her. He brings her hands up to his face, his touch light and almost reverent. Lyla stares at him, her face turning bright red as her heart starts to pound for a different reason. Viorst keeps a firm hold on her as they finally step out of the lake and onto solid ground. Waiting for them on the dirt path are two ornate carriages, looking completely out of place in the wilderness. Lyla follows him toward the lead carriage, still stunned by the sudden turn her life has taken. Viorst throws a dry cloak over his shoulders and looks back at her with a calm, inviting expression. Suri, the red-haired guard, is there to open the door and welcome them inside. Suri gives a polite greeting, acting as if it's perfectly normal to welcome a soaking wet girl into a royal carriage. They climb inside the plush interior, leaving the cold dampness of the lake behind. Viorst sits across from her, looking perfectly composed despite his wet hair. The carriage wheels begin to turn, starting their journey away from the only place she's ever known. Lyla sits huddled on the bench, still feeling the lingering chill of the water in her bones. Viorst watches her with a playful smile, clearly enjoying her confusion. She stays silent, her lips parted in surprise as she realizes he's not going to stop staring at her. He leans back against the cushions, looking like a man who just secured the most valuable prize in the world. Lyla looks down at her lap, her hands trembling as she tries to process the fact that she's still alive. She's still on edge, her years of abuse making it impossible for her to trust this sudden kindness. Viorst tells her there's no need for her to be afraid or apologetic anymore. He reaches out and pulls her toward him, his strength making it impossible for her to resist. Before she can even react, she's sitting right on his lap as the carriage bounces along the road. He looks at her with an intensity that makes it hard for her to even breathe. She asks why he keeps saying things like that to her, her voice small and filled with doubt. Viorst just leans in closer, telling her that he knows she's hiding a secret from him. Lyla's mind drifts back to the harsh day she was cast out, accused of being a witch by those she once trusted. Back in the carriage, Viorst's fingers tilt her head up, forcing her to face him and his intense gaze. He holds her there, his presence overwhelming as she blushes, trapped between her fear and in strange new curiosity. Legends tell of the bloody battles fought by the ancestors of the Onlion Empire to secure their throne. The first emperor of Onlion appeared like a god amongst men, his sword glowing with a terrifying divine light. He led his knights to a brutal victory, establishing a dynasty built on power and absolute dominance. The lineage continued through fierce rulers who kept wild panthers as pets, showing their control over even the most dangerous beasts. Each successor carried the weight of the crown, their eyes reflecting the same golden fire as the predators they tamed. Viorst lets out a soft, knowing chuckle, the weight of that violent history sitting easily on his shoulders. He pulls Lyla onto his lap and holds her close, as if she's the most precious treasure he's ever found. The carriage finally arrives at the massive, glittering palace that stands like a beacon in the dark night. Inside, Viorst sits at a grand dining table, looking every bit the refined and dangerous prince he was born to be. Lyla stands at the entrance, her chest heaving as she tries to adjust to the overwhelming opulence of the room. Viorst looks up and greets her with a charming, almost mischievous smile that makes her heart skip a beat. She enters the room hesitantly, feeling completely out of place in her borrowed finery and surrounded by gold. Viorst makes a show of carrying her through the halls later, much to the surprise of the bowing servants. He introduces her to Cecil, the head maid, while still holding her hand with a strange, possessive familiarity. Lyla is soon whisked away to a luxurious bath, where she screams in shock at the sheer extravagance of it all. After being cleaned and dressed, she is escorted back to the dining room where Viorst is patiently waiting. She looks at the mountain of food before her, feeling more confused than ever about why she's being treated this way. Viorst just smiles, seemingly amused by her constant state of wide-eyed bewilderment. She sits down at the long table, moving with a hesitation that speaks of her long years of isolation. He leans in, his golden eyes searching hers as he asks if he really appears so monstrous to her. Lyla's thoughts drift to the stories of magic she's heard, wondering if her current reality is just some kind of spell. The sound of the running water from her bath earlier still echoes in her mind, a stark contrast to the quiet forest. She remembers the legends of witches and their strange powers, feeling the heavy weight of the name she was cursed with. The dining hall feels too large and too quiet as they sit together in an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Viorst reaches out and kisses her hand, a gesture of respect that feels alien and terrifying to someone like her. Her face burns with heat, her instinct telling her to pull away even as her heart tells her to stay. She thinks of how her sister Ariadne used to laugh at her while she was forced to huddle in the dirt. She fidgets with the expensive brooch on her chest, the jewels feeling heavy and wrong against her skin. Night falls over the palace, bringing with it a deep, heavy darkness that swallows the sprawling gardens. Later that night, Lyla stands by her bedroom door, unable to sleep in such a grand, unfamiliar place. She turns to Cecil and asks if the maid can smell the stench that she's so famous for. She flinches when Cecil hesitates, her heart sinking as she already knows what the answer will be. Cecil admits that the odor is indeed unpleasant, confirming Lyla's worst fears about herself and her curse. Lyla's shoulders slump as she looks away, the cruel reality of her condition crashing back down on her. Cecil looks at her with a pained expression, clearly regretting her honesty, but unable to tell a lie. The maid turns and leaves, the heavy silence of the room feeling more oppressive than ever before. Meanwhile, Suri makes his way through the palace corridors with a purposeful, silent stride. He enters Viorst's study, where the prince is already busy going through a mountain of documents. Suri bows deeply to his master, ready to give his nightly report on their mysterious guest. Viorst reaches up to loosen his cravat, his expression darkening with a mixture of desire and frustration as he thinks of the intoxicating scent that only he can smell. Suri looks completely stressed out as he tries to explain the situation. He leans over the desk, practically pleading with his boss to listen. Viorst isn't having any of it, his brow furrowed in a deep frown. Another aide joins in, both of them trying to get through to the prince. Viorst just closes his eyes, looking like he's got a massive headache. The two men start sweating, realizing they've pushed their luck too far. Viorst flinches as if something physically repulses him. A high-ranking priest walks past them with a calm expression. The prince grips the arm of his chair so hard his knuckles go white. Later that night, Viorst is still at his desk, buried in paperwork. Morning hits the imperial palace, looking bright and peaceful. A maid knocks on the bedroom doors to start the day. She peeks inside, her face tight with worry. The massive bed is empty, not a soul in sight. She starts searching the room, checking every corner. The balcony is also deserted, with no signs of life. A cold chill runs down her spine as a pair of beastly eyes flash in her mind. Suddenly, she hears a rustling sound coming from the wardrobe. Lyla is standing right there, looking like a deer in headlights. She's biting her lip, her expression full of distress. Memories of the fire and her old cabin start to overwhelm her. Images of Viorst coming to her rescue flash through her mind. Lyla clutches her head, the trauma making everything spin. Sweat beads on her forehead as she struggles to stay grounded. She stares off into the distance, completely lost in her own head. The maid approaches the wardrobe cautiously. The girl's hands are trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes are wide with a frantic, restless energy. She's actually huddled deep inside the wardrobe, hugging a pillow for dear life. The maid calls out to her, trying to break the trance. She reaches out, finding the girl tucked away in the shadows. The servant looks down at her charge with genuine pity. She tries to gently coax Lyla out of her hiding spot. Lyla finally looks up, startled by the soft voice. The sun continues to shine over the beautiful palace grounds. Lyla eventually makes it to the table and starts eating like she hasn't seen food in weeks. She's dining with Viorst, who just sits there watching her quiet intensity. She slows down, taking a much smaller, more polite bite. Her face flushes bright red when she realizes how much he's been staring. Viorst rests his chin on his hand, looking quite entertained by her embarrassment. She tries to speak through a mouthful of food, looking totally flustered. He just takes a calm sip of his drink, letting her struggle through it. Viorst watches Lyla, his eyes full of a strange, possessive focus. The dinner continues, with Lyla still feeling out of place in such a grand setting. She's clearly nervous, barely touching her food as she looks around. Lyla looks stunning when she's cleaned up, like a completely different person. Viorst can't take his eyes off her, seemingly entranced by her presence. Lyla is overwhelmed by the luxury, her face showing a mix of wonder and fear. He gives her a small, almost imperceptible smile, trying to put her at ease. Back in his study, Viorst returns to his cold and calculated princely duties. Lyla is introduced to her new life in the palace, overseen by a stern maid. She's brought to the massive imperial library, her new place of work. A maid hands her a scroll, her expression unreadable. Lyla takes the document, feeling the weight of the new responsibility. They go over the protocols she's expected to follow from now on. The reality of her situation starts to sink in, and Lyla looks quite shaken. Her eyes fill with tears as the trauma of her past continues to haunt her. Suddenly, the silver-haired Grand Duke Lumiere makes his entrance. The Emperor watches the palace interactions from his high throne. Lumiere doesn't waste any time, striding past the servants with authority. He has a sharp, determined look in his eyes as he heads for Viorst's office. The Grand Duke marches through the palace halls with a heavy stride. He bursts through the doors, not caring about protocol or privacy. Viorst is at his desk, his expression turning cold at the interruption. Lumiere stands over him, demanding to know what he's thinking. He's furious about the way Viorst has been handling recent diplomatic matters. Viorst doesn't even stop writing, his pen scratching against the parchment. He finally looks up, his gaze every bit as sharp as his brother's. Lumiere slams his hand on the desk, insisting that Viorst listen to reason. The tension between the two is palpable as they face off in the quiet room. Lumiere's eye twitches, his anger barely contained behind his noble mask. He catches a glimpse of a woman in his mind, the catalyst for all this drama. Realizing he's getting nowhere, Lumiere turns and storms out of the room. Outside in the palace gardens, a much more refined scene is taking place. Elizabeth of House Remoate, Viorst's fiancée, sits elegantly for tea. She's waiting for the prince, but her expression is anything but welcoming. Viorst arrives and sits across from her, his face a mask of cold indifference. Elizabeth grits her teeth, clearly annoyed by her fiancé's lack of warmth. They sit in a beautiful outdoor gazebo, surrounded by decadent suites. Lord Valencia is there too, shaking hands with a man in a green coat. Elizabeth puts on a fake, polite smile, but her eyes tell a different story. Viorst continues to ignore her, looking completely bored with the entire meeting. Fed up with the cold treatment, Elizabeth stands up to make her exit. Viorst just gives a small, satisfied smile as she finally walks away. Elizabeth is fed up with Viorst's cold attitude and snaps at him during their tea. Viorst stands his ground, looming over her with a cold and piercing gaze. He gives her a mocking grin, clearly enjoying her frustration and anger. His eyes glint with a dangerous satisfaction as he watches her squirm. Viorst leans in close, his presence suffocating and deeply intimidating to the noblewoman. Having had more than enough, Elizabeth storms off, leaving the garden gazebo in a huff. Her face is twisted in pure rage, her teeth gritted in absolute annoyance at the prince. She marches toward her carriage, ignoring the beautiful palace grounds around her. She's met by her attendants, but her mood remains foul as she prepares to leave. Meanwhile, in the palace library, Lyla takes a moment to stretch her tired and aching muscles. She looks around the massive room, still amazed by the sheer scale of the Imperial Library. Lyla ponders her current situation, wondering what Viorst truly has planned for her future. She's startled by a sudden noise in the quiet room, nearly dropping the items she's carrying. Her face flushes with embarrassment as she realizes she was lost in her own thoughts. She notices how much her appearance has improved since coming to live at the palace. Her eyes widen as she spots an unexpected and very unwelcome guest entering the room. It's Elizabeth, looking as haughty and entitled as ever in her elaborate red gown. Lyla is frozen in shock, not expecting to encounter the prince's fiancé in this part of the palace. Elizabeth scans the library with a look of utter disgust, her eyes quickly landing on Lyla. The two women face each other, and the tension in the air becomes thick and uncomfortable. Lyla tries to maintain her composure, but she's clearly intimidated by Elizabeth's presence. Elizabeth turns away with a sharp, dismissive movement, her dress swishing against the floor. She moves with a practiced, noble grace, but her actions toward Lyla are anything but kind. She begins to speak to Lyla, her voice dripping with undisguised malice and contempt. Her red eyes flash with a cold anger as she stares down the blonde girl. Elizabeth begins to walk away, but she's not done hurling her petty insults yet. She lets out a cruel and mocking laugh at Lyla's expense, enjoying her superiority. Her smug expression is enough to make Lyla's blood boil with frustration. Lyla's patience is wearing thin as she listens to Elizabeth's constant and cruel belittling. She clenches her fist by her side, struggling to keep her rising anger under control. Elizabeth gestures dismissively toward the door, telling Lyla she should know her place. She looks down on Lyla with a sneer, completely convinced of her own noble superiority. In a fit of petty and unbridled rage, Elizabeth lashes out, causing a loud crash in the library. She's absolutely fuming, her face contorted in an ugly display of aristocratic anger. Lyla isn't backing down this time, her blue eyes flashing with a newfound and fierce resolve. Elizabeth shouts at her, calling her a lowly wench who has no business being in the palace. She warns Lyla to stay out of sight until the engagement ceremony has finally concluded. Her mouth is set in a thin, hard line of pure hatred as she delivers her final ultimatum. With one last hateful glare over her shoulder, Elizabeth finally prepares to leave the library. She huffs as she walks out, her ego clearly bruised by Lyla's refusal to break. Lyla is also huffing, her chest heaving with the intense effort of holding back her words. Furious and needing an escape, Lyla throws open the large library doors to leave. Lyla, now dressed in more appropriate attire, walks through the opulent palace halls, feeling the weight of many curious eyes upon her. The persistent whispers of the palace servants are impossible to ignore as she passes by their secretive huddles. She looks back at a senior maid, her expression one of quiet exhaustion and lingering frustration after the day's events. Only moments earlier, the palace staff had already been abuzz with scandalous news of her confrontation with the prince's fiancé. Lyla had rushed through the library doors, her mind reeling and her heart pounding from Elizabeth's cruel insults. She was immediately met by the other maids, one of whom blocked her path with a dramatic and theatrical flourish of surprise. Later, she finds herself seated for a lavish dinner with Viorst, though the tension between them makes even the finest food unappealing. Viorst remains entirely calm and composed, taking slow, measured sips of his wine while he silently watches her every move. Lyla jolts in her seat, nearly choking on a small bite, as she suddenly realizes the prince has been staring directly at her. She looks up at him, her own expression a complex mixture of nervousness and growing defiance as they share a long, silent moment. Viorst begins to speak, his tone remarkably calm as he gestures toward the table, perhaps in an attempt to ease the heavy mood. After the difficult dinner, Lyla retreats to a balcony, seeking the solace of the cool evening air under the vast, starry sky. Her quiet moment of reflection is interrupted when Viorst appears, looking surprisingly informal with his shirt partially unbuttoned. Lyla turns toward him in genuine shock, her breath catching at his sudden and completely unexpected presence on the balcony. As he reaches out toward her, she instinctively flinches, her body reacting with a wariness born from her past experiences. She bites her lip, the emotional turmoil she has felt throughout the day finally threatening to spill over in his presence. Viorst pauses for a second, his sharp eyes taking in her obvious distress and the visible trembling of her small hands. He quickly closes the distance between them and grabs her arm, his grip firm and steady as he anchors her in place. Lyla stares up at him, the pale moonlight highlighting the intense conflict and confusion written across her face. Driven by a sudden, desperate need for clarity, she asks him directly if he truly loves the woman he is engaged to marry. She watches his face with intense focus, her heart pounding in her chest as she waits for even the slightest hint of a real answer. The only sound on the high balcony is the soft rustle of their expensive clothes as they stand only inches apart. Lyla's blue eyes search his own for any sign of a lie or a hidden truth about his upcoming marriage to Elizabeth. Viorst doesn't answer her with words, but instead gives her a soft and enigmatic smile that only serves to deepen the mystery. Lyla's heart starts thumping against her ribs as Viorst stands close to her on the balcony. He gives her a heavy, lingering look that makes her feel completely exposed. She's totally paralyzed as he suddenly leans in. Inside, Viorst drops to one knee and says something that completely blindsides her. Lyla can barely process it. He wants them to have a child. He reaches out, his fingers brushing against the side of her neck. He cups her face, forcing her to focus only on him. Viorst explains that this is the only way to secure her place in the empire. Lyla is in total shock, but her body isn't telling her to run. The air in the room feels like it's vibrating with tension. She stares up at him, her pulse racing. Viorst doesn't wait for her to think it over and pulls her onto the bed. Lyla's face is flushed as she gets swept up in the heat of the moment. Viorst peels off his shirt, looking like he's finally claiming a prize. He leans down, his breath grazing her skin. He pulls her into a deep kiss. The rest of the palace fades away as they're left alone. Lyla gasps as the reality of the situation hits her. Viorst moves over her with complete authority. He captures her lips again, not giving her a chance to breathe. He's got this predatory smirk on his face like he's finally won. They're completely lost in each other as the night drags on. For Lyla, this is the first time she's ever felt wanted, even if it's like this. She lets out a shaky breath, her eyes fluttering shut. Viorst watches her with an intense, satisfied gaze. His hand tangles deep in her long blonde hair. He's inches away, fully focused on her. Lyla shifts under his weight, her mind a total blur. He pulls her back in for another long kiss. He's making sure every part of his plan is set in motion. From the outside, It looks like a moment of pure passion. But beneath it all, the beast is finally devouring its flower. He takes everything she has to give. By the time morning comes, Viorst is already staring out at the rain. He shoots one last glance at Lyla, who's still fast asleep. He reaches out towards her one last time before pulling away. Back to reality, Cecil bows low as the prince prepares for his duties. Viorst's warm expression from the night before is completely gone. Lyla's eye snaps open as she finally begins to wake up. She sits up in the massive, empty bed, trying to remember where she is. But a sudden, sharp pain hits her right in the stomach. She collapses back onto the pillow, feeling completely drained and sick. Lyla wakes up with a deep blush, the events of the night before playing over in her head. She remembers the warmth of being held, a feeling she never thought she'd know. But Viorst is already back to business, walking through the palace with his attendant, Suri. Suri looks like he's struggling to keep up with the prince's brisk pace. Viorst stops to look out a window, his expression unreadable and distant. Outside, the rain continues to pour down over the palace gardens. He's got that sharp, predatory look in his eyes again. He thinks about the online curse, the dark fate that awaits any woman who carries their blood. For 60 years, every empress has died the moment they brought a successor into the world. It's a cycle of death disguised as a royal duty. He remembers the stories of the women who came before, their lives traded for the empire's future. Viorst's heavy boots click against the marble floor as he makes his way through the halls. He meets his inner circle at the entrance to the throne room. He steps forward to face the one man who controls everything, his father. The emperor, Onlion IV, gives him a smirk that's more of a threat than a greeting. Viorst stares him down, his golden eyes glowing with a quiet intensity. After the meeting, the clouds finally break and the sun shines over the city. Back in her room, Lyla is still deep in a heavy, dreamless sleep. She finally groggily sits up, feeling more exhausted than when she went to bed. She rubs the back of her neck as her maid, Cecil, enters to check on her. Cecil stops dead in her tracks, staring at Lyla like she's seeing a miracle. Lyla tries to ask what's wrong, but she feels strangely light. Cecil's jaw drops as she slowly approaches the bed. Lyla looks at her reflection and realizes the cursed aura she's always had is gone. Cecil gasps out that the stench Lyla has carried since birth has completely vanished. Lyla is stunned. The one thing that made her an outcast is just gone. She clenches the bed sheets, her mind racing with what this could mean. Cecil looks like she's about to faint from the shock of it all. Lyla doesn't wait for an explanation and bolts out of the room. She sprints through the palace corridors, her heart hammering in her chest. She spots Viorst talking with Suri out in the courtyard and runs toward them. She's moving so fast, her hair is flying wild behind her. She skids to a stop and grabs Suri by the vest, desperate for answers. Suri is totally panicked, having no idea why she's suddenly hysterical. Lyla looks past him and sees Viorst watching her with a cold, detached look. Suri looks between the two of them, sweating under the sudden pressure. Lyla's hand trembles as she grips her dress, a sudden wave of nausea washing over her. Suri tries to force a nervous laugh to lighten the mood, but it's not working. Her vision starts to swim, and she collapses onto the cold stone floor. The world around her starts to fade into a blur of gray. Viorst finally steps forward, his cold mask slipping for just a second. Lyla reaches out and grabs his sleeve, her eyes pleading for help before she passes out. Viorst stares down at Lyla as she breaks down, his eyes filled with a heavy, unspoken intensity. She's sobbing into his chest, the reality of her new life finally shattering her composure. He doesn't pull away, but his face remains a mask of cold, royal detachment. Viorst stays on his knees, holding Lyla close, while Cecil and Suri stand by, unsure of how to help. Later, Viorst is in a rage in his private study, the room a mess of overturned furniture and scattered scrolls. Suri stands by the door, keeping a respectful distance while the prince vents his frustration. The chaos in the room is a direct reflection of the storm brewing inside Viorst's mind. Cecil enters and bows low, likely delivering news that only adds to his stress. As the night deepens, Viorst stands by the window, his silhouette dark against the moonlit garden. His sharp gaze is fixed on the horizon, his mind already calculating his next move. He knows that in this palace, every moment of peace is just a prelude to a new battle. He eventually makes his way to the heavy, ornate doors of the emperor's audience chamber. An official inside looks like he's about to have a breakdown, just being in the same room as the royal family. Seated on the throne is Onlyan IV, Viorst's father, who watches him with a piercing, judgmental stare. He looks completely at ease, despite the tension radiating from his son. Viorst stands his ground, the silence between them thick with years of resentment. He clenches his fist so hard his knuckles turn white, a small gesture of his internal struggle. He has to remain composed. Showing emotion in front of the emperor is a dangerous game. Onlyan IV lets out a sharp frown, clearly displeased with whatever Viorst has to report. The two men engage in a silent standoff, neither willing to be the first to blink. Viorst's golden eyes flash with a mix of defiance and deep-seated pain. The emperor speaks, his voice likely dripping with the cold logic that has defined their dynasty. He reminds Viorst of the curse, the blood that was spilled to ensure the continuation of their line. The vision of a dying mother and a newborn heir is a ghost that haunts every generation of their family. He speaks of the sacrifice as a necessary evil, his words cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. Suddenly, Viorst's heart hammers painfully against his ribs, a physical reaction to his father's cruelty. He clutches his chest, his face contorted in a silent grimace of agony. The emperor just watches, a faint, mocking smirk playing on his lips as his son suffers. Viorst's knees buckle, and a thud echoes through the room as he struggles to stay upright. He looks up at his father, seeing the same cold beast he is terrified of becoming. The official from before is stumbling back, terrified of the darkness emanating from the two men. Onlyan IV lets out a low, satisfied smirk, enjoying the display of his son's vulnerability. He leans back, the picture of a man who knows exactly how to break those beneath him. Back in the guest quarters, Viorst stares out at the garden, his heart still heavy with his father's words. Lyla is finally awake and trying to act normal, having tea with Cecil in a sunlit pavilion. She carefully lifts her cup, but her hands are still slightly trembling from the stress. As she takes a sip, her collar shifts, revealing the dark bruises Viorst left on her skin the night before. Cecil's eyes narrow as she spots the marks, a flicker of worry crossing her face. Lyla catches her looking and instantly freezes, a wave of self-consciousness hitting her. Their quiet moment is interrupted by a man in elegant white robes, the Grand Duke Lumiere. He raises a hand to signal he means no harm, but his sudden appearance is startling. Lyla looks up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity about this new visitor. Lyla looks up at the silver-haired Lumiere, her face pale with shock at the Grand Duke's sudden appearance in the garden. Nearby, a pristine piece of strawberry cake sits on a gold-rimmed plate, a silent observer to the palace's shifting power dynamics. In another part of the palace grounds, Elizabeth of House Remoet sits across from Viorst, her hands folded as she tries to maintain her haughty poise. Viorst takes a slow, steady sip of his tea, his sharp golden gaze fixed on the ambitious noblewoman who desperately seeks his favor. The air is thick with a silent, uncomfortable tension as Elizabeth struggles to find a topic that will pique the prince's interest. She eventually picks up a piece of cake with a sharp movement, her mounting frustration at Viorst's indifference starting to show. A thin, mocking smirk touches Viorst's lips, signaling his complete disdain for her attempts at graceful flirtation. Elizabeth forces a light, practiced laugh, hiding her growing anger behind a hand placed delicately against her cheek. She finally turns away, unable to bear the cold, judgmental weight of his unwavering stare any longer. Viorst suddenly presses his fork into a ripe strawberry, the sharp movement breaking her brief moment of avoidance. Elizabeth's own eyes flare with a malicious red light, her entitled nature finally showing through her crumbling mask of nobility. Viorst just holds the strawberry up, a dark, amused grin on his lips as he continues to taunt the woman he clearly considers beneath him. Lyla sits alone, staring into her tea as the steam rises. She's completely lost in thought, her face heating up as she remembers what happened. Her mind drifts back to last night, to the moments she spent with the prince. Viorst was intense, his presence overwhelming her in the dim light. Lyla couldn't look away as he leaned in, his eyes fixed solely on her. The air between them was electric as they finally gave in to the moment. Lyla had never felt anything like it, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. The scent of him was everywhere, intoxicating and impossible to ignore. He held her close, the beast finally claiming what he'd been hunting for. The next morning, Viorst stands there, looking as powerful as ever. Lyla is back to her usual self, though the blush on her cheeks hasn't quite faded yet. She tries to act normal while enjoying some quiet time in the garden. But she's interrupted by a man who looks strikingly similar to the prince. Lyla freezes, wondering who this silver-haired stranger could be. Cecil looks just as worried, sensing the tension in the air. Lyla asks who he is, her voice trembling slightly as she stands her ground. The man introduces himself as Lumiere, the Grand Duke and Viorst's uncle. He watches her closely, his expression unreadable as he takes in the girl Viorst chose. Lumiere's gaze is soft, but there's a warning hidden beneath his polite words. Lyla isn't sure what to make of him, but she doesn't pull away. He reaches out and gently lifts her hand. He places a polite kiss on her knuckles, maintaining his composure. They stand together in the gazebo, a picture of courtly elegance. But the peaceful moment is shattered when Viorst suddenly appears. Viorst starts getting dressed, his eyes never leaving his uncle. He buttons his shirt slowly, the silence in the room becoming suffocating. Viorst brushes past him without a word, his annoyance clear. Lumiere looks genuinely rattled, his calm facade finally starting to crack. Viorst turns back, his arms crossed as he stares the Grand Duke down. He looks completely bored with the conversation, his eyes cold and distant. Lumiere is visibly sweating now, struggling to keep his voice steady. Viorst just smirks, enjoying the way his uncle is squirming. He knows exactly what Lumiere is trying to do, and he's not having it. Viorst leans in with a dark grin, letting the threat hang in the air. Lumiere is left trembling with rage and fear as he watches the prince. He turns to leave, his pride wounded after the short confrontation. Viorst remains, his expression softening only slightly now that they're alone. Later, Lyla is served a lavish meal, the table filled with everything she could want. But she doesn't have much of an appetite, looking pale and exhausted. Her fork slips from her hand and clatters onto the floor. Cecil rushes to her side as Lyla suddenly collapses in her seat. She covers her mouth, a sudden wave of nausea hitting her with full force. Viorst bursts into the room, calling out for Lyla. Lyla sits up in bed, looking surprised to see him. A doctor is by her side, checking on her. Viorst rushes over, his concern for her obvious as he approaches the bed. He reaches out, a soft smile playing on his lips as he looks at her. His staff stands behind him, looking a bit confused by the sudden display of affection. Suri, Cecil, and another aide watch quietly. Viorst leans in close, whispering something private just for her. He takes her hand in his touch gentle but firm. He gives her a warm, reassuring smile, his golden eyes filled with an intense focus. He helps her up, his attention entirely on her as he ignores everyone else. Lyla can't help but feel a bit flustered under his heavy gaze. Viorst watches her every move, his expression softening more than he'd ever allow in public. Lyla offers a bright smile, her eyes sparkling with happiness. They sit together on the edge of the bed, the tension finally beginning to ease. Viorst looks more relaxed than usual, a small, genuine smile on his face. They share a lighthearted moment, their laughter filling the quiet room. He reaches out to pat her head, a simple gesture of comfort that makes her blush. Later, Suri and Cecil hurry through the palace halls, likely on their way to attend to more royal business. In the throne room, the emperor sits tall, listening to the report of an elderly advisor. A blonde noble bows low before the emperor, showing his respect for the crown. The grand hall is filled with the weight of political discussions and hidden agendas. Viorst stands apart from the court, looking sharp in his white uniform as he examines a silver necklace. Lyla is absolutely radiant as she wears the new jewel, her eyes glowing with happiness. They spend the afternoon in the garden, the grand palace standing tall in the background. Viorst sits with her, listening as she talks about her day. Lyla breaks into a wide, happy laugh, her eyes closing as she enjoys the moment. Viorst can't help but smile back, his gaze lingering on her face. He reaches out to pull her closer, wanting to keep this peaceful feeling alive. He pulls her into a tight hug, his laughter echoing hers as they share a private joke. Lyla leans into him, her heart full as she looks at the man who saved her. Viorst looks genuinely happy, a rare sight for a man usually so cold. They return to the garden pavilion, where Lyla has been spending her time. The palace gardens are in full bloom, a beautiful backdrop for their quiet afternoon. Lyla sits at the table, focused on the books in front of her, as she tries to learn. She bites her lip in frustration, the lessons proving to be more difficult than she expected. Viorst stands over her, offering a word of encouragement as he watches her struggle. He gives her an encouraging smile, clearly proud of the effort she's putting in. Lyla reaches for the book again, determined to get it right this time. Viorst picks it up for her, his eyes twinkling with amusement at her persistence. They sit together in the bright room, the sounds of the palace far in the distance. Suddenly, Lyla winces in pain, her face contorting as a sharp cramp hits her. Viorst is by her side in an instant, his smile replaced by a look of deep concern. Lyla's breath hitches as she tries to push through the sudden wave of sickness. Lyla looks up at Viorst, her expression a mix of worry and relief as she recovers from her sudden spell. Viorst kneels by her side at the study table, his attention entirely focused on her well-being. A sudden chill seems to pass through him as he looks at Lyla, his eyes narrowing with a dark intensity. He reaches out, his hand hovering just inches from her as if afraid his touch might break her. Lyla suddenly lunges forward, pulling him into a tight, desperate hug as if seeking shelter. Viorst is momentarily stunned, his eyes wide as he processes the sudden physical contact. Her heart thumps loudly in her chest, the sound echoing in the quiet of the room as she clings to him. They stay like that for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Later, Lyla spends her time studying in the library, a stern-looking tutor guiding her through her lessons. The long hours of study begin to take their toll as Lyla finds herself dozing off over her books. She startles awake, her hands scratching at the desk as she tries to refocus her mind. Beads of sweat roll down her face, her expression one of pure exhaustion and hidden pain. She stares at the pages before her, the words blurring as her thoughts drift elsewhere. She rests a hand on her stomach, a faint smile touching her lips despite the discomfort she feels. Viorst and Lyla stand at a distance from each other, a vast emotional gulf seemingly growing between them. Lyla clenches her fist, her knuckles turning white as she tries to suppress the tremors in her hands. Meanwhile, the Emperor, Clark de Onlien, takes a slow sip of wine, his expression one of cold calculation. He sits at a lavishly set table with Lord Valencia, the two of them engaged in a serious discussion. They shake hands, gold coins scattering, as if to seal a lucrative and shady deal involving Lyla. Lord Valencia bows low before the Emperor, his posture one of complete subservience. Viorst watches the exchange from the side, his jaw tight as he sees the man who should have been Lyla's protector betraying her. Viorst's golden eye narrows, reflecting his growing anger and the dark thoughts swirling in his mind. The Emperor hosts a formal dinner with Viorst and the silver-haired Grand Duke, Lumiere d'Estri de Onlien. Lumiere bows respectfully, his expression carefully neutral as he acknowledges the Emperor. Clark offers a sinister smirk, clearly enjoying the power he holds over everyone at the table. Lumiere stands near Viorst, a silent and noble presence in the room as they navigate the treacherous royal politics. Viorst walks away with Suri following close behind, his red-lined uniform billowing as he leaves the tense atmosphere. Later, Lyla turns with a bright, genuine smile, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Viorst. She stands before him, looking radiant in her pink gown as she holds a bunch of fresh green herbs. She shows the herbs to him, her expression full of hope and excitement. They stand together in the grand, high-ceilinged hall of the palace. Lyla gives him a beaming smile, her joy momentarily masking the darkness that surrounds them. Her laughter is bright and infectious, a rare moment of light in the cold palace. But the air around Viorst seems to grow heavy and dark, a sinister aura manifesting behind him. Lyla's smile falters, beads of sweat breaking out on her forehead as she feels the sudden shift in the atmosphere. She flinches, her hand going to her chest as she realizes something is terribly wrong. The herbs she was holding fall from her trembling hands, scattering across the floor. Viorst's boot steps forward, a heavy and deliberate sound that echoes in the silent hall. He offers a smile, but it's one that doesn't reach his eyes, looking more like a predator closing in on its prey. Lyla's eyes go wide with fear, her breath hitching in her throat as she stares at him. Later, Viorst tosses his ornate uniform jacket aside with a frustrated gesture. He collapses onto his bed, his head in his hands as he struggles with the dark impulses and the burden he carries. Viorst grits his teeth in frustration, the weight of his secrets and Lyla's condition pressing down on him. He turns to the window, staring out at the darkening sky as his mind races with dark thoughts. A single candle flickers on his ornate desk, casting long, dancing shadows across the quiet room. Viorst sits at his desk, furiously writing orders, while his loyal aide, Suri, stands ready behind him. Suri watches his master with a look of growing concern, the rapid scratching of the pen the only sound in the tense silence. Viorst's hand moves with clinical precision as he grips the pen, his focus sharp and unwavering on the tasks at hand. He clenches his jaw, a low growl of frustration escaping his lips as he struggles to maintain his composure. For a brief moment, a memory of Lyla's radiant, innocent smile flashes through his mind, a sharp contrast to his current turmoil. He recalls the cowardly Lord Valencia, whose greed and neglect have already caused Lyla so much pain and suffering. Viorst's expression hardens with deep disgust at the thought of the man who would so easily betray his own daughter. In another part of the palace, a grim scene unfolds as the body of Count Remoet is found lying in a pool of blood at the foot of the stairs. A witness gasps in horror, the brutal reality of the court's deadly power struggle laid bare for all to see. Viorst stands in the shadows, his silhouette dark and imposing as he continues to maneuver through the dangerous political landscape. Elsewhere, Lyla rests her hand on her stomach, her face pale as a sudden wave of nausea and exhaustion washes over her. Beads of sweat break out on her forehead, her breathing shallow as the physical toll of her secret pregnancy begins to show more clearly. She feels her strength failing, her body drooping as she struggles to remain upright amidst the growing physical strain.